I'm Madeleine Scammell. I'm an associate professor of environmental health at Boston University School of Public Health, and I serve on the Environmental Justice Oversight Panel. And I am going to launch this panel. I want to thank Anna Rosofsky, who really did a lot of the work in preparing this panel and guiding us as the oversight panel. Okay, so now I have the honor of introducing this workshop and want to start with a little bit of context. I think most of us know environmental justice is not a new concept in the United States. It goes back to the 1960s, even before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And nor is the movement of grassroots activists working to stop environmental injustices a new thing. The first presidential executive order on environmental justice was 30 years ago this year. And it was over 20 years ago that the Institute of Medicine and National Academies of Sciences and the National Institutes of Health wrote several reports acknowledging the importance of participatory and community-based research for achieving environmental justice. However, it wasn't until our last presidential election that the concept of environmental justice was brought up in a debate. It was toward the end of a debate in October 2020, and the question came from the moderator. It was directed at the then incumbent President Trump. She said, "People of color are much more likely to live near oil refineries and chemical plants. In Texas, there are families who worry the plants near them are making them sick. Your administration rolled back regulations on these kinds of facilities. Why should these families give you another 4 years in office?" Then President Trump's response was that those families are making a lot of money and he's saved the oil industry. In the response from our now President Biden, he referred to both fence line and frontline communities getting sick from pollution. A week after the debate, Rolling Stone magazine published an article with the headline, "Another Reason We Can't Breathe," a reference to the last words spoken by George Floyd and over 70 other people who reportedly died in police custody, saying those last words, "I can't breathe." Poor air quality and the abuse of power are two sources of heart-stopping hazards, and they're not typically included in cumulative impact assessments. So what exactly is environmental justice? If we go to the EPA.gov/environmental justice website, right there on the first page, I'll read the definition. It means the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, in decision-making and other federal activities that affect human health and the environment, so that people are fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental effects, including risks and hazards, including those related to climate change, the cumulative impacts of environmental and other burdens, and the legacy of racism or other structural or systematic barriers, and so that people have equitable access to a healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment in which to live, play, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage in cultural and subsistence practices. This definition does not include people who are biologically susceptible to hazards, and it is notable for acknowledging the legacy of structures and systems in this country that have contributed to inequities experienced today. The Biden administration has done a lot to elevate and support environmental justice and cumulative impacts assessments affecting programs at the federal, state, and local levels. And as we began to talk about this morning in our meeting of the HEI EJ Oversight Panel and Advisory Council, many low-income white people in this country do not identify with environmental justice, and many people push back on the concept. Just last week, attorney generals from 23 states filed a petition with the EPA demanding, not asking, not suggesting, I don't think that's what attorney generals do, that the agency amend its regulations under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prevent EPA from pursuing claims related to discriminatory effects of decisions and limit response to intended or purposeful discriminatory actions. So that is the context. We are in some exciting times, and we have an excellent panel of speakers from the federal, state, and local level, and academics. And I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Neeta, Thakur, who will introduce them.
Thank you, Madeleine. I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Neeta Thakur. I'm an associate professor at UCSF. I'm also on the research committee as well as the Environmental Justice Oversight Panel. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who's Dr. Baptista. So I'm trying to figure out how to pull up her. Here we go. Okay, while that's getting figured out, Dr. Baptista is an associate professor in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management Graduate Program at the New School University. She also serves as the co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Anna's professional practice is focused on advancing environmental justice through critical participatory action research on issues ranging from cumulative impacts to climate justice. Her current research explores the equity implications of industrial carbon management and state-level EJ policy making. Please welcome Dr. Baptista.
All right, everyone's sugared up, right, for the afternoon? So I picked the right panel to go right after ice cream. All right, I'm gonna make sure I stay on time here. Well, thank you for inviting me. I think it's really a testament to HEI that you have a panel and an advisory group that's really focused on environmental justice. It's really critical that we consider these issues. I'm gonna try to walk you through very briefly the evolution of state, mostly state, but government response to environmental justice over the last several decades. So it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind. I'll do my best to stay on time. But as you heard earlier, environmental justice is not a new thing. The calls for environmental justice from communities that are most impacted go back decades and generations. And communities have not only called for governments to step forward and protect their communities, but they've also honed this call, this demand, specifically focused on cumulative impacts, disproportionate, disparate impacts that affect frontline and fence-line communities that are bearing the brunt of a legacy of environmental pollution where they are located. So many homes located, co-located with industrial pollution. And unfortunately, the regulatory system that we have today is not was not intended to really protect these communities in the way that many of the environmental justice advocates call for. We have a very media-based approach to regulation that treats industries pollution by pollution, chemical by chemical, specific sources, and it doesn't look at the whole picture of cumulative burdens that many of these communities face. So what communities really came forward and started to demand was not just environmental justice policies that improved access to more participation, more studies, but really wanting an evaluation and a consideration and decision-making around the combined risks from multiple sources of pollution. And to their credit, many states, I'm going to try to focus at the state level because I know I have colleagues on the panel that'll go deeper into the federal response to environmental justice. But many states around the country really started to hone responses from the demands they were hearing from local communities. And so starting as early as the 1990s, when we saw the first executive order by President Clinton on environmental justice, states began to form environmental justice advisory groups, environmental justice guidance documents, and we started to see a very procedural approach to responding to environmental justice demands. And by 2007, the mid-2000s, we start to see states codifying some of these responses to environmental justice in the form of executive orders of their own, or advisory panels, hiring personnel staff in their regulatory agencies around environmental justice. Today, all 50 states have some codified form of EJ policy or guidance in place. And a great resource for those of you who haven't seen it yet, the University of Vermont Law School, together with several centers, including my own, developed an update to the EJ state by state. So you can look that up, and you can look at any state and really look at some of the policies that each state has promulgated. But I would say that most of the early government response to EJ was squarely focused on advisement, studies, really studying the problem. This notion that today we take for granted that there is in fact a disproportionate, disparate impact on environmental justice communities that extends even beyond environmental exposures, right? To social stressors, many different types of stressors that communities face. That was not a foregone conclusion. In fact, I was in the room in the 90s and the 2000s when people said, there's no such thing as environmental injustice, prove it. And in fact, there were wonderful scientists and community organizations that went out and did prove it. They showed empirical study after empirical study that showed the prevalence of this disproportionate siting, disproportionate burdens faced by communities. So now we see it as ubiquitous, it's everywhere, but there's still a question: what are we to do about it? Other than studying the problem and establishing advisory panels and study panels, how is environmental justice, this thing we've acknowledged exists, actually informing our decision making, particularly for governments, right, and regulatory positions? And what we see is that several states are on the forefront, really leading innovation in terms of legislation, regulation, to address cumulative impacts. We see many more states taking on this idea of cumulative impacts and developing mapping tools, developing guidance documents for enforcement policies, and in some cases, we see states actually incorporating environmental justice and cumulative impacts into permitting and regulatory decision making. And there are several great resources here that I won't have a chance to go through. The National Caucus of Environmental Legislators has a great resource you can check out on states that have cumulative impacts. There's also the Environmental Council of States that has another database. The Sabin Center at Columbia developed model legislation that you can take a look at for states and localities. And my own center has a database of cumulative impacts methodologies and laws and policies both enacted and proposed. So there's a really rich database of policies to draw from. And I would say in the last 4 to 5 years, what we've seen is really the next level of iteration in terms of cumulative impacts policy and decision making. We've seen several states since 2020 actually enact legislation, new legislation that explicitly targets cumulative impacts and embeds it into decision making. We have states like Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and others codifying cumulative impacts legislation. Some of that legislation directs the state to develop methodologies and mapping tools for cumulative impacts. Some states like New York and New Jersey actually have incorporated into rulemaking that applies to permitting for industries, both new and renewed industry permits, which is, for the environmental justice movement, a huge leap forward. The ability for communities to use cumulative impacts to not just say what are the burdens, but to say to industries, no, no more. The adverse impacts that you are adding to this community will no longer be allowed on the basis of cumulative impacts. It is a huge step forward. And even though it's a huge step forward, it's just one step. because many of the communities that are facing cumulative impacts need many more policies to help them get out from under a legacy of cumulative burdens. So just saying no to new things is really a small step forward, because there's still already grandfathered in a huge landscape of burden that exists that still needs to be contended with. So, but nevertheless, we see states on the front lines really innovating. And why is that? There's a whole host of reasons, from a policy perspective, why certain states really take up the mantle, not least of which is the fact that there are many EJ advocacy organizations on the ground pushing them to do this. There's also quite a bit of innovation in terms of the tools used to assess cumulative impacts. And you'll notice that I keep saying cumulative impacts, not cumulative risks, okay? And I know for those of you in the room who are risk analysts and risk scientists, the debate about whether the existing risk assessment frameworks were sufficient to really fully bring into bear the social stressors, all the different types of stressors that communities faced, was not sufficient. Communities were not satisfied, and really we weren't going far enough in terms of the cumulative burden that communities faced. So many of the states and community advocates really pushed for an indicators-based approach. And that's what you see with states as early as California. California was really a pioneer in this area. They developed one of the first cumulative impacts mapping tools, the Cal Enviro Screen, which was based on the EJ Screen tool that was developed with academics, Rachel Morello-Frosch and her team, and environmental justice advocates. That became the prototype for Cal Enviro Screen, which is now in its 4th iteration. So it's a really well-developed tool, well-tested tool that's being used in California, and it became the model for many other states to develop their own tools. That we have things like New Jersey EJ map, the New York City DEC, that's a more recent map that was developed for their cumulative impacts assessment law. And there are really some common steps in developing cumulative impacts approaches that states have taken, this is not in the exact order that it happens, because each state takes a different pathway in terms of how they approach cumulative impacts. But certainly there's a step that involves compiling a lot of stressor data, lots of different types of either environmental exposure, social stressors, health stressors that then become, that get compiled. They usually get looked at in terms of the coverage, many of them at the state level. Do we have a robust enough sets of data to cover the whole state? Key terms have to be defined. Throughout the panels I've been listening to disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities, communities of concern. There are, in New Jersey, we call overburdened communities. These terms all have to be defined somehow. So that's also an important step. There's also a question about the geographic unit of analysis. And then there's a really important step in terms of determining appropriate thresholds for indicators, right? At what point does a stressor become adverse, cumulative, disproportionate, unreasonable? These are all terms that get defined. And how they get defined are deeply normative questions. So that's the point here I really want to drive home is, when policymakers, regulators, advocates are sitting at the table discussing an approach to cumulative impacts, decisions have to be made about what is fair. What is the right threshold? And again, those are deeply normative and moral questions that need to have advocates who are most directly impacted in the room deliberating on, right? Those are not just technical questions. And these innovations are not just happening at the state level. I wanted to put in a plug for the local municipalities, counties, public utility areas, regional boards that are also innovating in this space. Back in 2018, I had a group of EJ advocates from Chicago come to me and say, we've been pushing for years to try to get our local city planners to stop these developments in our communities. And they keep telling us there's nothing we can do about it. The city has no purview over these developments. And they disagreed, and they asked, can you look around the country and see what folks are doing at the local level in terms of environmental justice? And we did a snapshot, and of course we found that cities have an array of tools at their disposal, actually, that they can use in terms of environmental justice. Everything from their public health codes to issuing moratoriums or bans on certain noxious land uses, developing proactive planning overlay zones, and even in some cases, developing their own environmental justice and cumulative impacts indicators. And I'm proud to say that a few years later, just last year, the city of Chicago implemented one of the first city-based environmental justice indices. So they really developed their own version of a cumulative impacts tool on which to base land use development decisions in the city of Chicago, which is a huge leap forward, right, from 2018, when they said they couldn't do anything. And we see cities like New York, they just recently also released their own EJ index tool. So cities are leading the way. And I'm going to wrap here by saying the federal government obviously is doing quite a bit on environmental justice and cumulative impacts. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that you all here at HEI are looking at air pollution and climate, right? And you're looking at environmental justice. And right now, communities across the country are raising really important questions about the risks of industrial carbon management and the climate mitigation pathways that are ahead. And they have real important empirical questions about the risks to their communities, the local health impacts and air quality impacts that come with things like hydrogen and carbon sequestration, carbon utilization and sequestration. And they need good scientists and health experts working with them to inform the processes that are happening in their communities. Unfortunately, a lot of their concerns and questions about the real risks and uncertainties of these industrial carbon management strategies are not being answered. They're being met with community benefits agreements about jobs, and not about the health impacts that they're facing. So we really need the collaboration of folks like you to really step in and play an important role in forming these billions of dollars that are going into the same frontline communities that are facing this legacy of cumulative burdens. And there's a risk that the climate mitigation pathways that are ahead will further entrench that legacy of environmental injustice and racism. So I just wanted to put in that plug because there's a lot of good things happening at the federal level, but there's also a lot more work that needs to be done. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Our next speaker is Veronica McBeth, MC Beth. Veronica McBeth was appointed as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy in September 2023. And prior to starting in the Office of the Assistant Secretary, she served as the Senior Advisor of the Federal Transit Administration. McBeth has a background in public policy, public outreach, transportation, planning, environmental regulations, and funding. At the Baltimore City Department of Transportation, she was instrumental in establishing transformative transportation facilities, including shuttle services, transit, incentive programs, and micro-mobility. As an expert in environmental policy and law, she connects environmental laws to policy issues associated with environmental justice, air quality, climate change, and sustainability as they relate to transportation. Through her work, McBeth has directly contributed to implementing transformative, equitable transportation projects.
Good afternoon, everyone. They gave her the long bio, so I apologize for that. They just copy and pasted that from the webpage, so disregard. And I think I'm still on somebody else's presentation, so no worries. Great. All right, so again, good afternoon, everyone. Again, Veronica McBeth, and I am here in the absence of my amazing boss, Christopher Coase, so you got stuck with me. But I'm more fun, so. So again, thank you, HEI, for having me. Just a little bit about myself that's not so boring. Grew up in DC as a public transit rider, probably since birth, lower middle class family, a little more on the lower and then middle class. So we didn't have a car. We took the bus, bus, subway everywhere. Became a bus rider by myself at the ripe age of 8 because I'm in my 40s, so I was a latchkey kid. So just to let you know, I'm living and breathing what I did grow up doing. So I understand the importance of doing the right things and helping people who are in overburdened communities. I grew up, like I said, in a poor neighborhood where nobody really had a car. Everybody did take the bus, went to a school that had very few resources and things like that. And so it was really important for me to come back full circle and make sure that I'm working in the communities that I grew up in, making sure that I'm giving back and doing the things that people need. And obviously, transportation is one of those things because it opens up the world to a lot of people. So getting started, talking to you about integrating environmental justice considerations into policy and regulatory decision-making. So just a bit here, giving you kind of the background of the executive order. So as Anna said, that I'm gonna kind of give you a little bit of the federal information. So giving you a little bit of the baselines. Executive Order 12898, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is where federal actions were created to address EJ for minority populations and low-income populations, and it was signed by President Clinton in '94, essentially. And this does not scan like I thought it would. Sorry, my bad. All right, there we are. Setting forth the agency's goals and visions and priorities based around executive order. Sorry, this is not, it's frozen. Give me a second. Here we are. All right, sorry. Executive Order 12898, back to it. So we're talking about the executive order that President Clinton put into place. So essentially identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects that specifically dealt with minority and low-income populations to the greatest extent and practicable and permitted by law. And so developing a strategy for implementing environmental justice and promoting non-discrimination in federal programs, and that would affect positively human and the environment and provide minority and low-income communities the public information and public participation access that they needed. So in 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14008, which created the Justice 40 initiative, and that aimed at increasing the amount of benefits and the disadvantaged communities within the activities of the federal agencies. And so in doing so, 40% of all federal activities, specifically in my area of transportation, specifically like infrastructure projects and things like that, 40% of all the funding that would come from infrastructure projects would go to overburdened and disadvantaged communities. And so, again, this executive order would try to essentially right the wrongs of the past, taking a look at historic inequities and racial discrimination and trying to correct these harms that people experienced before, resulting specifically from federal activities. So then moving on to Executive Order 14096, it challenged a whole of government approach to environmental justice that, as it was creating just treatments and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, and agency decision-making and other federal activities that would affect the health and human environment of people. And so digging in a little deeper into 14096, it further directed that federal agencies would develop an agency environmental justice strategic plan. And so this would set forth the agency's vision and goals and priority actions and metrics to address and advance EJ and to fulfill the directives of this order. And so to identify and address the opportunities to improve the accountability and compliance with any statute the agencies administers that the effects of health and environment of the communities with environmental justice concerns. And so with EO 14096, the agencies were to conduct an environmental justice assessment, and that evaluates the effectiveness of the agency's plan. That includes the evaluation of the agency's strategic plan and its implementation and barriers for the implementation and any steps that they've taken or currently taking to address them. And so we will be releasing a policy statement in the next few weeks that will talk about our efforts to incorporate a holistic strategy that aims to ensure that the traditionally underserved and disadvantaged communities will experience more of the benefits and less of the burdens of transportation projects that we have currently working on and the ones that we have actively done in the past that have impacted communities negatively. And so taking a look here at the DOT strategic goals and priorities, it's important to highlight what the agency's strategic goals and priorities are. So our goals and strategic priorities are not only the clearest representation of our values, but also the role that we have been playing in improving transportation in our communities. And our strategic goals go across all the elements of our work at DOT. So not just within one office administration, but at the whole of the agency. And it shows that it is really critical to advancing our commitment to environmental justice. And safety is our North Star. So how does the project advance safety and moving us closer to eliminating transportation-related serious injuries or fatalities, or taking a look at our economic strength and global competitiveness? What are we doing to make sure that we remain globally competitive by creating good-paying jobs and ensuring that American workers and businesses have reliable and safe and efficient access to resources? And of course, equity. DOT wants to make sure that we are investing in projects that reduce inequities across our transportation system and ensure that small towns and urban residents and tribal populations all have access to safe and affordable and multimodal options. And then climate and sustainability. We also focus on climate and sustainability as it relates to making sure that we are actively reducing greenhouse gas emissions and building a more resilient and sustainable transportation system. And then taking a look at the incorporation of community. So obviously community is important, and it's very vital to make sure that we are successfully delivering projects. And so we put out a guide that is called the Promising Practices for Meaningful Public Engagement, and it's transportation decision making. So this was to help and is to help the funding recipients that have received federal funding, and it basically uses the public in various stages of transportation decision-making and building their organizational capacity to do so. So essentially, if you are looking for technical assistance to get federal funding, or if you have already received federal funding, this particular book allows you to get more direction in how you can successfully utilize the funds or how you can learn how to better apply and get the funding. So for public involvement from the beginning through a project's life cycle, it has the potential to help projects come to life a lot faster and has the potential to help projects meet the needs of the community. So the document here provides and shares definitions of what actually meaning public involvement and promising practices are, and essentially addresses the barriers to inclusion in transportation decision making. So taking a look here at Justice 40. What is Justice 40 and why do we have Justice 40? So DOT recognizes, again, as I said, the past transgressions of how many times we failed to address inequities or have even made them worse in communities. And so in light of this, DOT is committed to pursuing a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all. And so, again, as I mentioned, we're making sure that 40% of the benefits from federal investments to disadvantaged communities that face burdens related to climate change, the environment, health, and other economic opportunity are being addressed in that certain way. And a core priority for USDOT is advancing equity and Justice 40 to begin to address transportation insecurity. So what is transportation insecurity? And that is what a key component of transportation disadvantage is. So transportation insecurity occurs when people are unable to get to where they go, where they need to go, and meet the needs of their daily and regular life. So trying to get to where they live, work, and play, trying to get to a doctor's appointment, trying to take their kids to school, and they're unable to do it safely, they're unable to do it regularly or even reliably, and they don't have the access or the transportation options they need. And nationally, there are well-established policies and programs that are aiming to equally address food insecurity that often are connective tissues along with housing insecurity, but not transit insecurity. And so we're looking to help combine and address those things. And so taking a look at equitable transportation community explorers. So this is one of the components of research issues that we are working with. And so we recently released this Explorer, which is a first of its kind transportation specific tool, and we call it the ETC. And this tool supports decision making for how resources and programs can best uplift under-resourced and transportation disadvantaged communities. And it harnesses census tract data that you can take a look at, and it helps you go across federally available data sources to provide users a centralized and easy-to-use platform that creates visibility for drivers of transportation disadvantaged areas. And the Explorer incorporates a transportation index also that incorporates 40-plus elements across 5 different categories. And again, that includes transportation insecurity, health vulnerability, climate and disaster risk burden, and environmental burdens, as well as socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And the 3 main core benefits of this are equity in planning, by understanding community characteristics and the key drivers of disadvantaged users, and how to increase the effectiveness of resources and allocation to improve the project. And so some of the localized decision-making in this are the use of MPOs, states, and other regional players that have more robust data systems and the insight to address the root causes of some of the transportation disadvantages. And lastly, taking a look at and making sure that you are able to build trust. And so one of the first steps is to effectively engage a community impact by a program or project that is understanding the root cause of transportation disadvantage. And so another component is a USDOT Mobility Equity Research Initiative. So this initiative recognizes the opportunity and challenge, and it's presented in Executive Order 14096, and it needs to ensure our science and research activities support environmental justice goals. And so to meet this challenge, DOT seeks ways to advance research and technologies in several ways. And so through this research notice of funding opportunity, and it was actually released earlier this year, we sought research proposals to support the department's goals in expanding accessibility and the mobility to underserved communities. And in doing so, the initiative sought the proposals that would produce the best results. And if you get a copy of my presentation, you can click on the link. I'll have several links at the end, and this can be shared at the end. So it closed on March 22nd, and there was one award of $2.9 million. Last thing I'll show is that DOT also plays a leadership role in implementing Section 5 of 14096 and bolsters the fact that one of our colleagues is a co-chair on the National Science and Technology Council and Subcommittee for this. And lastly, I will show a link to all of our resources. Again, I'll make sure that it is circulated in a copy of our presentation. That's the end, and I will look forward to answering any questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
All right, we now have two presenters that I'll go ahead and introduce from the EPA. So the first person is Dr. Chris Frey, who is the Assistant Administrator of the Research and Development at the US EPA. He is also the agency's Science Advisor, and previously Dr. Frey was a Futrell Distinguished University Professor at North Carolina State University, where he served on the faculty since 1994. He chaired the EPA Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee from 2012 to 2015, and he served on the CASAC panels for every criterion pollutant. He also has a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon. Our second speaker is Dr. Onyemaechi Nweke. Dr. Nweke is the Senior Science Advisor for the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at EPA. She provides technical consultation to EPA's programs on science and policy issues related to environmental justice and represents EPA and OEJ ECR on federal interagency initiatives to address EJ and health equity. She currently leads interagency activities to identify and address scientific and analytic barriers to integrating EJ and risk assessments in decision making. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Mechi and I have a lot to share with you in a short amount of time, so I'm just going to dive in. So we're going to talk about integrating environmental justice into research and action. And I always like to start with the mission of the agency, and which is to protect human health and the environment. And our first administrator, William Ruckelshaus, set forth three foundational principles to follow the science, to follow the law, and to be transparent. Our current administrator, Michael Regan, has set forth a fourth principle of advancing justice and equity. So these guide everything we do at the agency. Veronica did a nice job of talking about the whole of government, at least at the federal level, expressions of priorities through executive orders. And so I've listed here 6 executive orders. I'm not going to go through these. They covered the same ground that Veronica talked about. But broadly, these address both climate change and environmental justice, and I wanted to speak to both of those. I also just mentioned there's a line on the slide that we're going to talk really a lot about the science in this presentation, but in terms of resources to help with action and implementation, the agency has over $40 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding to support greenhouse reduction and climate and environmental justice grants. And so that is an important resource for many folks. So I had the Office of Research and Development. About a year ago, we received advice from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on transforming EPA science to meet today's and tomorrow's challenges. And the overarching advice from the academies was to adopt a one environment, one health framework as part of a systems approach to thinking about our research. And it's not that we need to do everything inside this framework all at once, but we should be able to think about what are the important parts of the framework where we would prioritize, and how do we make linkages and address big challenging problems. So I'm not going to go through this very complicated diagram, but it speaks to not just the source to outcome continuum that many are familiar with, but also the different layers of organization from cellular scale to human populations to ecosystems, and how those are all interrelated. So, keeping in mind the interaction between humans and the environment at these different levels of organization, we're investing in innovative and high-profile research that also address the major policy priorities of the administration. And our role in ORD is to think about how do we develop the science to support decision-making in these priority areas. So we're doing science research to support environmental justice, including cumulative impacts research. We're also doing climate change-related research. and we're incorporating community-based science into our work. Anna already mentioned about cumulative impacts, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. But one of the things we did in 2022 was we developed a report really to ourselves to identify what are research needs and cumulative impacts and cumulative impact assessment to inform our strategic research action plans across our 6 national research programs. We had this, we shared this with the Science Advisory Board and received important comments from them. And also this slide in the bottom has a couple of links that we thought would be useful to you. One is a commentary on challenges and opportunities for research supporting cumulative impact assessment, and the other is a commentary on redefining exposure science to advance research supporting cumulative impacts. And part of what we want to do is we're doing intramural research. I'll also talk about extramural research, but we really need everybody to lean in on this, and so we're happy to share our ideas with you and hope it's helpful. So climate change and environmental justice are, of course, closely related, and prior speakers have already addressed this. We think about how climate change affects the source to outcome continuum and how the source to outcome continuum affects environmental injustice, and that climate change is likely to exacerbate these injustices. But there is the option for identifying impacts and then implementing solutions to try to mitigate against this. And so we're very interested in taking a holistic approach that includes reducing environmental and health inequities, as well as responding to the impacts of climate change. So, as a federal agency, one of the things we do, like the USDOT, is we think about, well, what new programs should we develop to support these priorities? And organizationally, we created a new integrated climate sciences division within our organization. I just want to focus on one of the details on this slide, which is our Regional Climate Assistance Network. And this is a new program intended to develop regionally relevant assessments, technical support, and capacity building for adaptation planning and resilience, with a special focus on frontline communities most vulnerable to climate change. Another thing in terms of thinking about a systems-based approach to addressing cumulative impacts and this nexus of chemical stressors, social stressors, including social determinants of health, and changing climate, is the systems framework of the exposome. And we could spend all day talking about the exposome. I'm going to spend about 5 seconds talking about it. But just to say that, this is a way we can think about how multiple different types of stressors, as well as salutogens, things that are beneficial interventions, could affect the external environment for a person, their internal environment, and the associated impact on health. So one of the things that's, I think very clear from this session is that, any of us up on the podium don't have all the answers, and we really need to look to the expertise of communities to understand not just their situations, but what interventions are feasible and sustainable to help advance justice and mitigate injustices. And so that introduces the idea of participatory science. In June 2022, the agency issued a vision and principles statement of a future where all parts of society help advance scientific knowledge that informs environmental protection. And actually, we don't really want this to be the future, we want this to be now. There's a link at the very bottom of the slide, and these slides will be available to you, that will bring you to some of these additional resources that are listed here. One of the new initiatives related to participatory science in the Office of Research and Development is a partnership, a place-based partnership we're doing with EPA Region 2, which is just north of us, on what we call the Community Engaged Research Collaborative for Learning and Excellence, or CIRCLE. And the purpose of CIRCLE is to help us in the agency develop our capacity for community-based participatory research, and to develop processes, procedures, tools, protocols in the context of the EPA, that will enable us to co-produce research with communities. Of course, this has many benefits, building long-lasting, trusting relationships with the communities with which we engage. We also are coming into this without a preconceived notion of what the problem is. We're going to look to the community to tell us what the problems are where we want to do co-produce research. We have a large enough research organization, we can reach back and find, we think, the right experts and expertise to address whatever those problems are. And also we want to, in addition to do joint research studies, have STEM engagement, and build capacity not just for ourselves, but with all of you and with communities. And of course, as others have pointed out, this model has been around for a while, and so, but we're happy to adapt it within the context of our organization. So the next few slides kind of give a summary of, kind of the nexus of things we're doing in the Office of Research and Development on scientific leadership. I've already mentioned some of the organizational changes. One other is we have an internal EJ council that is developing metrics so we can track progress and hold ourselves accountable for change. We have been very active in sharing what we have learned about research needs more broadly with the scientific community through SOT and other professional societies, and with our stakeholders and partners, such as with the Environmental Council of States and our Tribal Science Council. We're also providing extramural research opportunities, and I have one to share with you at the end. We're engaging with our science advisors through federal advisory committees. We've also commissioned the National Academies to do a State of the Science review of cumulative impacts and advise on the path forward. We're hoping it's kind of along the lines, for those of you familiar with the Red Book, kind of like a Red Book for cumulative impacts. So in terms of our intramural research, we have, as part of our fiscal year 23 to 26 strategic research action plan, cutting across our entire organization, we've identified over 140 environmental justice and cumulative impacts projects, and I'll go through each one individually with you for the next several hours. No, I won't do that. What I will do is just highlight a few of these. So on vulnerabilities and exposure, for example, we're looking at the effects of historical redlining on climate and health vulnerability. Looking at characterizing health and ecosystem impacts, we're doing what I think is really exciting and interesting work on characterizing the effect of chronic stress on susceptibility to adverse impacts of air pollution in disadvantaged communities using inflammation and epigenetic biomarkers. But this also lets us look at salutogenic interventions, to borrow some language from Jacoby Wilson, who some of you I'm sure know. And then we're looking at mitigation options and solutions, such as assessing built, natural, and social vulnerabilities and the impact of climate change near contaminated sites to promote equitable climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. And then also we're developing a number of tools and resources to support decisions. I'll just mention one that's a fairly recent one. It's called the Equitable Resilience Builder. And this includes very close engagement with communities, including participatory mapping, storytelling, participatory indicator assessment, and action planning. And I hope that sounds interesting. And please, the hyperlinks here that you'll have, you're welcome to look that up and make use of that. I realized I went to the next slide already. So we also, our mission is to develop and translate science to inform decisions. So we're about bringing science to decision makers through our internal regulatory action development process within the agency, with our state and tribal nation co-regulators. We provide technical support to all of the above. We provide training. We're working, for example, with Region 5 on health impact assessment training. And we also are communicating, and there are lots of resources in these little tiny links that I invite you to look at. And then I mentioned about doing place-based research. Some of that we're doing through our STAR grants, and we're also doing quite a bit intramurally. For example, we have a solutions-driven research project, in our in a community in the Chesapeake Bay. We have 7 place-based projects with EPA regions. We're doing place-based work on wildfires, and also I mentioned circle and participatory science. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Onyemaechi.
Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. And today I'm going to talk about the work we've done to identify the scientific and analytic issues that limit the ability of our human health risk assessors to identify and account for environmental justice in human health risk assessment. Just to set the foundation, human health risk assessment is the very basis for a lot of the decisions that we make at the EPA, especially when it comes to our health-based decisions. We rely heavily on human health risk assessment. And so in many ways, human health risk assessment, despite noted shortcomings, does offer ample opportunity to integrate some of the concepts that you've already heard about today. And so what we set out to do with our risk assessors was beginning to think, we started the process of thinking about risk assessment in terms of how we've been able to integrate issues related to vulnerability and susceptibility in the past, and then to ask the question, how can we use this concept of vulnerability and susceptibility to identify those population groups that have greater exposure to chemical stressors and or greater sensitivity to chemical stresses. And so when you think about any one environmental justice community that you can think about, you tend to have a convergence of both issues related to exposure to the chemical stresses that we regulate, as well as issues related to the social and economic conditions, or as we would talk about it in public health, conditions that degrade health and don't support well-being. And so on the one hand, we have to think about aggregate exposure. Lead is a good example where you walk into a community and they have lead in drinking water, they have lead-based paint issues, maybe they have legacy lead issues from the gasoline era, lead in gasoline era. We have to take that into account where we can. And then for those fence line communities that are living, that have as their neighbors industrial complexes that are releasing chemical pollutants into the ambient environment, they have exposures to these chemical mixtures, which can either affect their sensitivity to the one chemical stressor that we're trying to regulate, or may even play a role in exposure to the chemical. There's also questions of biological factors. I want to believe that at EPA, because of the work we've done with children's environmental health, we've done a pretty good job and still have miles to go with addressing biological factors such as life stage. So of course, communities with EJ concerns have children, they have adults, and recently with Executive Order 14096, we now have to think about disability. I tend to think about disability and pre-existing disease in the same way. You're looking at communities with elevated baseline incidence of disease, and this has implications for either exposure to chemical stressors and or sensitivity to those chemical stressors. I tend to like to think about it in terms of individuals with, say, liver cirrhosis or hepatitis B or end-stage renal disease. So what is the impact of these kinds of diseases on absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion? If you don't have the right, if your kidneys are not functioning well, it's very difficult to process and excrete toxic substances. And then the dark blue bucket is the social and economic exposures. And so in the work we did, we decided to focus in this area because it offers, there's a lot of room for growth, and it offers ample opportunity for us to do things a little bit differently. And so this is where we think about the role of poverty, psychosocial stress, and food insecurity, and things like poor housing quality, and the effect that it possibly has on the chemical risks that we're trying to manage. So we convened over a roughly 2-year period risk assessors across the agency's programs, and we talked to them about how they would integrate social susceptibility, which is what we're calling that dark blue bucket, into the human health risk assessment paradigm. We asked them to think about and offer us a system of inquiry. What are the kinds of questions you need to answer to be able to account for social susceptibility? And then we asked them to think through the strategies that they would use to respond to those questions. And in the process, we had them identify what the gaps were, what are the data barriers, what are the methodological issues you're running into. And then we went a step further and asked them, so if you had Christmas season and risk assessment, what kinds of data and methods would you ask for in order to be able to address those needs you identified? We talked about the issues within the context of these 3 big steps in the risk assessment process. So looking at hazard assessments, exposure assessments, and risk characterization. And so I'm going to present you with the findings. So this is not an all-inclusive list of what we uncovered, but what we've done is, well, what I've done for this event is knowing that researchers were coming here and that there are some issues that are really big and foundational. I picked on those types of issues, and the goal here is to share this with you so that we can begin to speak and talk about the ways that we can all be invested in addressing some of these issues. So the first thing, issue is around scientific knowledge. Our risk assessors did indicate that we do need more knowledge about how social factors are driving chemical stressor-related health risk. We need to understand better what that intersection is between the social and the biological. We need to understand how you go from living in suboptimal social conditions to biological endpoints and health outcomes. And they suggested that one of the ways we could do this is to increase evaluations of social factors as effect modifiers in our EPI studies. And then we also talked about, well, are we going to have new cohorts? Well, there's a lot of cohorts and a lot of data that has already been published and a lot of studies that have been done historically. And one of the suggestions they had is maybe we can mine existing studies for evidence of effect modification from social factors. So these, again, are ideas, and I'd love to hear from people what your thoughts are. Another suggestion was around the issue of systematic lit review. So this is usually the first step in your hazard assessment process. And they were thinking about and proposing that we need to develop strategies for conducting these systematic lit review searches so that we can pick out those studies that are relevant that would tell us about social factors. So this actually addresses issues such as, well, what is the appropriate search string? And can we come up with search strings that are specific as well as sensitive enough to pull out these types of studies from the literature? And then the second issue we talked about is data, and there was a call to improve data quality to strengthen social susceptibility evaluations. Issues identified include inconsistent reporting of social factors in the literature, which in turn limits synthesis of information and our ability to draw inferences across multiple studies. A good example is socioeconomic status. It can be measured as poverty, wealth, household income, even educational attainment. But we know that somebody living at the poverty line in Washington, D.C. is not the same as somebody living at the poverty line in Alabama. We also know that $100,000 income in New York City is not the same as $100,000 in Oklahoma. And then each of these indicators actually tell you something about the pathways through which socioeconomic status is either affecting exposure and or sensitivity, and they don't all tell the same story. They tell the same big story that there's a role for socioeconomic status, but the pathways through which you get to an end is a little bit different. And so when you look across multiple studies and you're seeing these different measures, our assessors indicated that it becomes difficult, especially when you don't have consistent findings to draw inferences. The second issue, which they talked about is spatial and temporal resolution issues, having those differences across various social factor data. And so it makes combining these social factors and alignment with chemical exposures a little bit difficult. So you have social data that was collected maybe 3 years ago, and you're dealing with chemical exposure data that was collected, say, in the last year. How do you put those two types of information together? And what's a thought process for doing that? And then this last bullet is very familiar, I'm sure. Underrepresentation of socio-demographic groups that are mostly affected by environmental inequities in national data sets. And Haynes is a good example where you don't have enough sampling of those racial ethnic minority populations in that data set. And then last but not the least is methods. This is the methods bucket. So we need standardized approaches for combining multiple factors to characterize social susceptibility related to the last issue around data. And so we don't really understand and need more information about the relative influence or impact of various social factors on health outcomes and chemical-related health risk. Usually, there are multiple social factors that you can use in any one analysis, but are they all contributing the same to the health outcome where I'm looking at? Is there a global social factor that's actually that can tell the story for 3 or 4 others? So can we use that one instead of using all 4 or 5 in the same analysis? So it's really unclear for them how best to weight individual social factors, especially when you're going to combine them, whether you're using an index approach or you're using some of the other approaches that are emerging. And ideally, getting to these parsimonious models where you don't have to have 10 different variables, but even for us to have that parsimonious model, what is a mind map? What is a way of thinking about how to, which indicators are telling you the most information that you need, and then what is the most appropriate suite of factors, as well as the strategies to include and exclude. And so that is what we did, and I will hand over at this point to Chris to continue with the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, thank you, Mechi. I'll just put up this last slide. We have a STAR grant opportunity that's open through June 26th. There's a QR code. It's on air pollution data to inform decisions in underserved communities overburdened by air pollution exposures. So if you're interested, please apply. And thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask the next set of speakers to come on up. I'm going to introduce all 3 of them, starting with María Belén Power. María Belén grew up in Nicaragua in the aftermath of the revolution, and she currently serves as the first ever Undersecretary of Environmental Justice and Equity in Massachusetts. Prior to this, she co-founded and served as Associate Executive Director of Green Roots, a community-based organization dedicated to improving and enhancing the urban environment and public health in the cities of Chelsea and East Boston. She was appointed by President Biden to serve on the newly established White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and she holds an undergraduate degree in sociology from Augsburg University, a Master of Public Policy from Tufts University, and a certificate in nonprofit management and leadership from the Institute for Nonprofit Practice. Sitting to her right is Deneen Simpson, who has worked at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for almost 3 decades. Deneen is a member of the agency's senior staff and serves as Director of Environmental Justice, appointed in April 2016, and is the agency's Title VI Non-Discrimination Coordinator, appointed in December 2022. In Deneen's role, her work includes advising senior leadership about environmental justice issues, concerns, activities, and opportunities. In addition, Deneen conducts the agency's EJ training and manages the EJ office that oversees the agency's language access and community outreach and engagement activities. And finally, Sofia Owen. uses the law to build power for communities of color and low-income communities. Whether directly representing a community group or drafting a policy, Sofia strives to put just transition theory into practice, creating solutions accountable to the people most harmed by extractive systems. She has a JD from Northeastern University School of Law, a master's in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And I should say, she is also the staff attorney for Alternatives for Community and Environment in Nubian Square, Boston, Massachusetts, and serves on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Take it away.
Bueno, hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es María Belén y como dijeron, soy de Nicaragua y soy la subsecretaria de Justicia Ambiental para el estado de Massachusetts. Y bueno, el tema de la justicia lingüística y el acceso a los recursos en tu propio idioma es súper importante para el tema de la justicia ambiental realmente. So for those of you who didn't understand, some of you did. My name is María Belén Power, and I am the Undersecretary of Environmental Justice and Equity at the state in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And language access and language justice is critical to environmental justice. And what you experienced in 10, 15, 20 seconds is what residents across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but also the country, experience when there are processes and procedures that happen without language access, especially the siting of industrial facilities that are highly technical and wonky and really hard to understand just in plain English, but even more difficult in technical language. So this is the governor and the lieutenant governor. This is the cover of our newly released EJ strategy in Massachusetts. And as many of you know, sort of two principles of environmental justice are meaningful engagement and equitable distribution. So different states have different definitions. The country has a different definition. But for us in Massachusetts, the two main principles are that, right? Meaningful engagement and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. And so in 2021 in Massachusetts, we had a pretty big victory. We had the roadmap law, next generation roadmap law, which had a few different critical pieces of legislation, and my colleague Deneen is going to talk about the cumulative impact piece. But we also had a couple other sort of pretty significant wins, and one of them is defining EJ populations, right? So we thought that was amazing and a big deal, and also kind of the bare minimum, right, of defining who are the folks that are most impacted by environmental and energy burdens as well. And so in Massachusetts, we have 3 criteria. It's language, income, and race and culture, sort of minority populations, right? And then there's a 4th criterion that combines income and race to capture folks that in Massachusetts have historically been excluded, that did not fit in the sort of initial mapping that we did. And by we, I mean when I was in the advocacy world, not in government. And so, this is sort of the Healy-Driscoll administration's commitment to environmental justice. We have 1% of the budget for the first time ever goes to EEA, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And while 1% seems pretty small, it really is significant for us, right? It's over $100 million, which is about 24% more for our agencies. And that means, the creation of my office, but also my team. There was never an undersecretary of environmental justice and equity, and now we have a team that has tripled, so that it went from 2 to 6. It's a pretty big deal. And we have $2 million for language access, right? So every agency under EEA, under the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, has resources to provide that language access for both interpretation and translation of documents. And we also have the sort of 1% budget also includes each agency having a liaison, a person at each single agency to coordinate around environmental justice. And like I showed the first picture, that is the cover of our first ever environmental justice strategy, which sort of lays out the roadmap for how we will implement and operationalize environmental justice in Massachusetts. So this is our team, myself and my colleague Crystal Johnson, who is Assistant Secretary. We're hiring a director, but right now there's a bit of a hiring freeze. So that's pending. Carly Lemoyne is our Deputy Director, and we have a Program Manager, a Liaison, an Executive Assistant. So like I said, we went from a pretty tiny team to a little bit bigger, but still small. So these are the agencies, right, to which environmental justice applies. In the Commonwealth, there are 14 offices and agencies that are now required to implement environmental justice into the work they do. So I'm not going to name them all, but from public utilities to recreation, to Department of Recreation, to environmental protection, to, you can read them all right there. And so this is what we talk about when we talk about internal engagement and coordination, right? So we talk about all of these different agencies really connecting so that we're not working in silos. Even within each agency, there are plenty of silos. So this is one way in which we coordinate internally among all the agencies. We also have the Environmental Justice Interagency Working Group, which is across secretariats. So Massachusetts Department of Transportation, Housing and Livable Communities now has a new name, Economic Development. So all of the secretariats under the governor have sort of this opportunity to collaborate and to coordinate on environmental justice through this interagency working group. And externally, right, how do we engage with communities? We have a few different ways. We have an Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We have, not we, communities have the EJ table, which I used to be a part of, but not anymore. They sort of coordinate on their own. It's an external body, but we meet with them sort of to hear their concerns and their priorities. We also have a Justice 40 working group, so just ensuring that as the Biden administration has made that commitment, that we also are distributing the benefits to at least 40% of the population. And so that's a working group that we convene, and it is organizations across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we have additional engagement, right? So project specifics or trainings and workshop listening sessions, but those are some of the ways in which we are engaging with folks on the ground. And then when I talked about the first two, sort of the two principles of environmental justice, this is what we mean, and this is how it shows up in my office and in the Commonwealth. So meaningful engagement means language access. It means engaging tribal and indigenous communities. We name that because it is a particular community that that has really not been at the table. I mean, there are plenty of communities that have also not been at the table, but tribal communities is high priority for our office. And also ensuring that the outcome is reflecting the process, right? So we can have more community engagement, we can have plenty of more night meetings, but nobody wants that. So just ensuring that those meetings, that engagement results in an outcome that reflects that process, and not just having more meetings for meeting's sake. And then equitable distribution, right? So workforce development, ensuring that the folks that have been excluded historically are benefiting from these clean energy jobs. Like I said, benefit versus burdens, which does not exactly mean cumulative impact, but I think those two terms sometimes get thrown out as similar ways in which we can measure environmental justice. Community benefit agreements, and finally, Justice 40. So ensuring that Massachusetts is also distributing resources in an equitable way. And with that, I will pass it to my colleague, Deneen Simpson, Director of Environmental Justice at Mass DEP.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to HEI for having us here. I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what I do at DEP. I'm hoping that it's transferable to all of you here today. There's a lot of scientists, there's a lot of lawyers, there's a lot of toxicologists at DEP that I don't understand half the things that they say. So I try to make sure that they break it down to me, to simplify it, put it in plain language so that we can talk to the communities about it. Thank you. So as María Belén said, you know, we do public involvement, we have the environmental justice strategy, which is fabulous, from 2024. Language access is very important, as she opened this meeting up with speaking in Spanish, which is a huge thing for us in the community. We'll go talk about metrics and data, cumulative impact analysis, which is groundbreaking for Massachusetts, some of the barriers that we see, and you know, where we're going and hopefully how we're going to get there. So public involvement, it's more than just holding public meetings. It's making sure that those community members who are being impacted are at the table, and not a meeting that is scheduled on a Wednesday and you send out the notice on a Monday. We need to take into consideration what's happening in the community, whether it's cultural events, cultural holidays, whether it's other community meetings happening in those communities that will bar some of the community members from coming to our meeting because they're talking with a community member about something that's happening in their community. We're talking about ensuring that there's early notification, again, advanced notification to the impacted community, and plain language is so important. We talk about language access, but we can translate our technical documents into the language that someone speaks as their native language. They're still not going to understand it. So you have to break it down, you have to simplify it if you really want to do meaningful engagement and have community involvement. Consider the impacted community. You know, we issue many, many permits across DEP, and we need to make sure that the community that's going to be impacted by this permit or whatever key agency action that we have has a seat at the table, has a voice, and not only that, but make sure that we consider the concerns that they have in the decision making that we do, and let them know how we use their comments and their concerns. We also have to make sure that, again, engagement is incorporated into the permitting or key agency action. I struggle and I have a challenge within DEP because we have permit deadlines. That's what the permitting staff look like. And then they want to incorporate community engagement, public involvement, language translation, and they want to fit that into that timeline. That should be a part of the key agency action, not an afterthought like, okay, where can I put that public meeting in? And then no one shows up and they look at me and say, Deneen, we posted it, we told them that, you know, we were having a meeting, no one showed up. How much notice did you give them? Do they understand that what the public notice said? Did they get the public notice in advance time that they can actually make preparations to attend that meeting? All those things need to be considered, just like issuing that permit by the deadline. The environmental justice strategy is pretty much a roadmap of how we do the work, how we're going to integrate environmental justice into the work that we do every day based on our mission and our key agency actions. So DEP is the agency that oversees clean air, water, and land. So with that, we have to take into consideration, what are we doing to make sure that the community is involved with everything that comes, everything that's going to impact them with their air, the water, and the land, and make sure that we have a comprehensive approach to making sure that they're a part of those conversations and they're involved. Some other elements of our EJ strategy is, you know, hiring and recruitment. I've been at DEP almost 30 years. A lot of us are at the end of our career, we're getting ready to retire. Our communities look very, very differently. When I went into DEP, it was very male, very pale, just saying. And so now we have to take a look at what our community looks like and make sure that our workforce reflects that. Another challenge within DEP, because people are resistant to change. They're comfortable with who they're comfortable with, who they've been working with for years. So that's a challenge, but that is part of our strategy, and it's a secretariat-wide approach that we're all taking. Language access. I don't really need to say anything more about that. That's very important, not just translation, not just providing interpreters at meetings, but making sure people understand what you're saying, and not just translating a document and saying, here's the Spanish language. Do they understand those technical terms? Do they understand the process? Do they understand how they can get involved and how they can be engaged with? Those are so important, not just translation or interpreters. Again, community engagement, public involvement goes without saying. How we do enforcement, where we do enforcement, what does that look like? Part of our EJ strategy. Grants and funding, when we talk about equitable benefits, are they able to access those grants? Do they understand the grant process? I know that there's some EPA folks here. I work very closely with EPA. I'm on grants.gov. I don't understand how to do any of those grant applications, but they do have TikTok centers, so hopefully that's going to help. CIA just launched this year. I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next slide. And then we're going to talk about metrics, where we are, where we're going. Again, language access, not just part of the EJ policy, it's part of Title VI. If you don't provide language access, you could be, looking at a Title VI complaint. So you have to think about that, and we think about that all the time. We also have the executive order that was just issued from Governor Healy, making sure that we provide language access and that we have the tools and the resources to do that. Know your demographics of the community. Go into the community knowing what the makeup is of that community, as well as, any concerns that they may have had. Translate documents, very, very important. Offer interpret and translation services. Oops. Metrics and data. How do we know how we're doing if we don't know where we are? A few components of our EJ strategy to make sure that we are able to find out this is where we are right now, where do we want to go, how are we going to get there? Community meetings, not just community meetings for projects, but community meetings just to listen, just to get input, just to get feedback. Again, hiring and recruitment, very important to diversify our workforce. CIA, this was a requirement of Chapter 8 of Acts of 2021. It's also known as the Climate Roadmap Act, directed Mass DEP's air quality program to propose regulations and to do that within 18 months of the law, which was in 2021. The regulations are now final. We now have a cumulative impact analysis for certain air quality permits. They will take effect on July 1, so any project filed after July 1 will be a part of the CIA process. There's a link to the CIA page, but has a lot of information. Hopefully it's in plain language that you all understand it. So I think I talked about this a little bit, but it's, we had a lot of community engagement. We had a lot of public meetings. Many indicators were brought forth. One of the issues is data. You all know about data because you all are pretty much researchers and you do that scientific stuff. DEP struggled with trying to put more indicators into the CIA process because without the data, you don't have anything to base it on. So while we received a lot of different things that people wanted us to look at, you can only look at the things you have data to support it. So we have 33, there's socioeconomic, health, nearby facilities, air quality and climate, nearby sensitive receptors, hospitals, childcare, long-term facilities, nursing homes, prisons, and then we're doing some modeling, and then there is a new tool that will look at air toxic risks. The public comment period for this was longer than typical, which was 60 days, which was needed because it's a lot of information to kind of wrap your head around and provide comments about. We will be doing a program review this year and next and up until 2035 because we're going to learn some things from this. This is new to us, so we'll definitely have lessons learned, best management practices, and hopefully we will continue to improve the CIA process and maybe include other media as well. So some of the barriers I've already said was the data is not available, so we couldn't, take into all the could not take in everything that the stakeholders were saying that what they were asking us to do. And again, it's only limited to certain air quality permits, so it's not everything that we do at DEP. And some of the concerns that EJ populations have, that's the term that we use in Massachusetts. We've heard many different terms over this day. Some of the concerns are things that we just don't address. Jobs, substance abuse, mental health issues. So we've gotten a lot of different indicators that the communities want us to look into, but we don't have the capacity and it's not in our jurisdiction, so we couldn't really address those. But again, hopefully we're going to get into different media and we'll be able to assist with some of those concerns. barriers in general with permitting at DEP, it has to be a priority for everybody. It just can't be me as the director of EJ doing this work. It has to be from the top. I used to say, I would need allies, but allies are what you have in war. So I say, you know, I have to have a champion. You know, I have to have that commissioner and those deputy commissioners as a champion for EJ and making sure that we are being held accountable for what we're supposed to be doing. It's a law and it's a policy, so we just can't say, you know, we're not gonna do it. We're bound to do it. Projects are not easily understood. Plain language, again, I cannot stress that enough. If you really want feedback or input, you have to put things into plain language so people can understand what you're talking about, how it's going to impact them, and how they can provide you impacts about their real life experience and what they're struggling with and what their challenges are. Community engagement and public involvement has to be adequate. There's nothing worse than saying, I sent out all these notices, I made all these phone calls and emails, and no one is responding. If they don't understand, they're not going to respond. Plain language is key. Are we making a difference? We'll know when DEP is no longer permitting facilities the same way that they're doing it now. You know, we can't talk about EJ, all the money that we're putting forward towards EJ staff, resources, and we're still permitting in those same overburdened and disadvantaged communities. We have to make sure that involving the community is organic. It isn't a force. It's part of the conversation. You get a permit, oh, is it in or near an EJ area? Let me look at the community groups I have to contact. Is English isolation a concern? Let me make sure that I get translation done. Those are the things that I'm hoping, as I continue to talk about EJ at DEP, that it becomes part of the work that we do and it's part of our DNA. Stakeholders and advocates have to be involved. We can't do this work without them. And I can't do the work without my lawyers, my technical people, my staff people, but we all have to be on the same page. And last but not least, I am a mighty office of 3. So it's myself, I have a full-time language access person, and I have a full-time outreach coordinator. I've been the director of EJ for about 10 years. I've been with the agency for almost 30. And I used to be a one-woman show, working very closely with María, Belén, and Sofia. So we're getting strong. We're a little group, but we'll keep plugging along, and we just got 7 new EJ folks across the agency. Not a direct report to me, but there's a dotted line. So hopefully we'll continue to do great work. Thank you. And now I'll pass it on to Sofia.
I don't work for the state, just to be clear, but I'm very lucky to have such wonderful people doing the work that we need at EEA and María, Belén, and Deneen. So I work at Alternatives for Community and Environment, which is a Black-led and predominantly Black-staffed community-based organization in Roxbury, which is a historically Black neighborhood in Boston. And our whole mission is to address environmental racism and classism, to create healthy and sustainable communities, and to achieve environmental justice. And just to ground us a little bit, you know, I think for a lot of folks, the idea of EJ was something that was new, or something that folks came to understand better in the summer of 2020 with the killing of George Floyd and COVID happening at the same time. Being in the EJ world and having lots of people have sort of a light bulb go off, my brain was like, well, welcome to the party. What are you gonna do about it? And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So this isn't new, as previous folks have said. So there's a well-documented history of the ways in which systemic racism have led to the outcomes that we see today. So it's in planning, in zoning, environmental policy making, and permitting decisions. And that is also the case in Massachusetts, where if you are a person of color, you have a 70% chance of living in one of the most polluted communities in our state, where if you are white, it is 1.9%. So we're doing a lot of great things, and we have a lot of work to do. And so just to tell you a little bit about Roxbury, which is where I work. So we have a community that is 53% Black, 29% Latine, and the median income is $25,937. And just for context, the whole city of Boston, it's $55,777. So that gives you an idea of some of the disparities. And in our neighborhood, it has the second highest adult asthma rate in the city, so it's 15.7%. And Black Bostonians are more likely to die of cancer than any other ethnic group in the city. At the same time, we have the biggest bus hub for the local public transit right in our backyard in Nubian Station, and our residents are more likely to live in public housing, depend on public transit, and also to bear the burdens that come along with that. And that includes having to wait over 64 more hours a year for the bus than white residents in Boston. So there are some deep disparities, but there's a lot of work that we are doing proactively to address those issues, and we're doing it side by side with residents. We work from the frame that we need both organizing and power building of the people most impacted, along with the legal and regulatory and policy tools that we have to address to make change. So María Belén briefly mentioned the EJ table. ACE was involved in the creation of the table along with Green Roots and Neighbor to Neighbor in 2019 to get the roadmap law passed, which was what resulted in the EJ population definition, the cumulative impacts assessment, some changes to ensure environmental justice was better considered in our in the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, and also what was the last thing? My brain just died. The EJ definition. Yeah. Okay. So it's been a long week. So we filed that legislation first in 2019, but that was an over 20-year battle to get just those baseline recognitions. So I think the key thing is that, as we heard from María Belén and from Deneen, there's a lot of great work that is being done by the Healy administration and that was happening before. And we have a long way to go. So, you know, I am very glad, for example, that we do have the cumulative impacts regs in place. They're not perfect, and we gave plenty of feedback to DEP about what we would have liked to see done differently. But before we had that, we didn't have anything but the EPA's whether or not air quality violated the national ambient air quality standards to base the denial of a permit on from a burden perspective. And all of Massachusetts is in attainment with the NAAQS. So even in communities like Brockton, for example, which is a place where it was a coal-fired power plant when it was proposed over 15 years ago. It's now a gas-fired power plant that ACE has been involved in fighting the permitting of for many, many years. It has the highest pediatric asthma rate in the state and was a hotspot for COVID, but even that was not enough. So we have pushed back, and in that case, we won a health impact assessment, which was the first of its kind for DEP and in the state, which was exciting, but it just goes to show that even with these tools, we still, there is still more that needs to happen. So the other thing that I think is really important to mention is just that, as other folks have hinted at, we can't study or advisory group or write a community benefits agreement or like risk manage our way out of these EJ issues because they're systemic. And so I think that's one of the hardest things in some ways, because you can fix, you know, you might be able to fix the one situation, but it's gonna happen somewhere down the road, right? Or it's gonna happen in another community. And so that's part of what I love about doing the work, not only on the local and state levels, but regionally. So an example that I'll give is we're part of the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a national alliance of community-based and frontline and EJ organizations. And in the Northeast, we've been pretty focused on pushing back on market-based solutions like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which was mentioned earlier, and the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And one of our concerns about both of those policies was that, yes, they result in overall emissions reductions, but as was pointed out earlier, studies have shown that they have gone up in EJ neighborhoods. And we did a very rudimentary analysis looking at some of the power plants in Massachusetts, and found, even just based on the data that was publicly available, that there were places where it had increased. And so for many years, we had been calling for the participating states in RGGI to undertake an equity analysis to look at this and to integrate what they found into a program review for the program. At the end of last year, we got that study funded through a private funder, and now there is going to be a regional analysis of the impacts of RGGI and compared with what it would look like if there were just mandatory emissions reductions in the communities around where we are. And I should say that's not just for Massachusetts. We're going to be looking at communities throughout the RGGI states, so New York, New Jersey, other places as well. And the idea there was one, that we need, we wanted data in general, and also that, regardless of what the study finds, I think that it will be useful information for all of us in all of the other policy work that we're doing. And that it is being asked for and guided by EJ organizations is what makes it different. Like the California study was done by the Union of Concerned Scientists. So just some key differences there, and just hammering home the point that was made by Deneen of residents in these neighborhoods are experts in what their experience is, and if you ask them, questions in ways that are not the words that we use as lawyers and scientists and health professionals, you'll get an answer. Like if you're talking to somebody about air quality or building emissions, they might look at you funny. But if you ask, do you know someone who has asthma? You'll get an answer. Or, do you find that it's harder to breathe at different times of day? Or like when you're walking home and you walk past a construction site, you'll get a different answer. So I guess where I'm going with all of that is that I think, I've seen research and collaborative partnerships done really well. I've also seen things go really poorly when people don't meet folks where they are, or when you come in with a preconceived idea of what you're going to get out of it. And then just the one other thing that I would say is that I think, to Deneen's point about making systems and information accessible to folks, yes, it is the law, and it is important from a civil rights perspective, but also it is ultimately going to result in more people better understanding and being able to then have a say in the decisions that impact them in their daily lives. And it'll make people more likely to want to show up for meetings, because we all know we don't need more meetings just for the sake of meetings. But so I think the last thing that I'll say is just to reiterate the point that was made by María Belén and also earlier by Dr. Baptista about the need for changing outcomes, and about the very real questions and concerns that folks have around well, you're making this wonderful, shiny process, and you're trying to get me to invest more of my time when I'm choosing not to spend it with my children or take time off work or, you know, any other number of things. But if we're just going to keep permitting things in the same way and the outcomes don't change, and we're going to have Teslas and heat pumps for those of us with money, and everybody else is going to be living in the same communities with public transit that doesn't run and, you know, bad air quality, that's not the world I want to see. So the point is that EJ requires us both to be changing the process to make it more inclusive, to get more feedback from folks, and to ask the hard questions that say, how does what we are doing now result in burdens on people, and what can we do to make those processes more open and to shift away from that harm? So, thanks.
Why don't we have our other speakers come on up and join the panel discussion? We have a short time for discussion. I do have a list of questions to get us started, but while we wait for folks to make their way up to the stage, I also welcome the audience to go ahead and make your way to the microphones if you do have any pressing questions for the group. That was really, really wonderful. Really touching on a lot of important topics of thinking about how do we move forward with environmental justice and think about it from what advances we need in research. But I really appreciate the attention to authentic engagement and relationship building and trust. And so I'm going to actually put my second question first, since many of you touched on the aspect of engagement and meetings and that kind of burden. So how do we effectively integrate community perspectives without overburdening communities and without removing the responsibility of, you need to fix this, to the community and not further tax community? And so I think examples are really helpful for our audience. You've talked and touched on a bunch of best practices and toolkits from the DOT, and then just now. But if you have any good examples, or even examples where it's done badly that you think people can learn from. No, I mean, right? The bad examples can be just as helpful as, you know, exemplary examples. I'm not sure if any of you want to start us off.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, positive examples. We have, so at ACE, we've had a focus on air quality since our earliest days. And one of the, so I guess two examples that I'll give really briefly. One is in the development of the diesel emissions reduction ordinance, which we led the effort to get passed in Boston, and it was a partnership between ACE and a bunch of other local organizations, but also within ACE, it was a partnership between our youth program and our lawyers. We had community members actually going out and doing surveys of people in the neighborhood and of, you know, their family members, and just asking a whole lot of questions that were developed in collaboration with folks with public health and science background to be able to help get a better sense of what conditions were on the ground, but in ways that were accessible to people who don't have the technical background. And then that information helped the lawyers to then draft what the language was based on the surveys and what we knew about the science around diesel emissions. And that got passed in 2015. And so that's one small example. And then the other one that I'll give is we have a partnership with folks at Owen College which is a local college in Boston. And we've had an almost 3-year air quality monitoring project where we have sensors placed throughout the neighborhood in different places. And so students were deeply involved in both helping to set up the monitors and sensors and then train community members on how to parse through and understand the information that you get from them. And then also there was a training on not just monitoring, but mitigating the harm. We installed HEPA filters in a bunch of our elder housing and other housing in the community so that people could not only be aware of what was in the air, but actually have improvements come from it. But that project came from us first. We wanted to do something that brought together both of those elements. And it was one of our funders and someone at Owen who just have had connections and trust with people that we trusted. And so that was how that came about. So I guess the lesson is that I think there's a lot of situations where community members know what the issues are and often have the lived experience, but don't necessarily have the data. So I think having studies that are driven by that first is the thing that I'd highlight.
Yeah, I really appreciate your discussion of co-development of the projects. It's not just one group leading it, it's really in partnership with the community leading the research questions and us being technical experts. So I'll go ahead and open it up over here to start with Dr. Fuller.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Christina Fuller at the University of Georgia. I'm also a research committee member for HEI and chair of the Environmental Justice Oversight Panel. And I've been holding this question since Dr. Baptista talked at the beginning. But anyone can answer. So I'm going to ask the question and then go a little bit into how I got to that question. We saw a lot, talking about the tracking of new and environmental justice legislation and bills and things like that and procedures. And I'd like to know, is anyone tracking bills and legislation that seem to throw up barriers against environmental justice? And how is that data being utilized? I come again from Georgia. And I do a lot of research with communities on air monitoring. There's a lot of funding from EPA and other agencies to build up community air monitoring programs and things such as that. And it's very important, of course, to fill in data gaps and also for empowerment for communities to advocate for themselves. And I don't study legislation, however, I try to be up to date. And so some colleagues of mine sent, back in February that West Virginia had a bill to make it illegal to use community air monitoring data in lawsuits. And so that's something that, is very much a concern because that can be expanded by other like-minded states. And, I just want to know, is anyone keeping track of that?
We are tracking bills that were proposed and not enacted. In our center, we really try to focus on the innovation that's being pushed by environmental justice communities and advocates around the country. So even if the bill didn't get through because of political opposition, we try to highlight the content and substance of the bills to show what's possible in concept, because we realize that in many states, they may never see the realization of a state bill because of so much opposition. And so that's why we looked at the sub-state level, at the local municipalities. When I did that local landscape analysis, it became very clear that there was a pattern of local bills pushing moratoriums and bans and land use reforms, and then a backlash wave of bills that came out from state legislatures banning the bans and really pulling back any delegated authority that municipalities had over many of these decisions. I suspect that similar things are starting to happen in the environmental justice and cumulative impacts landscape. as blue states are innovating and other states are trying to adapt some of those models to their states. There's a sort of a backlash. But I think it's a great project to also monitor some of the backlash bills so that we have to play offense and defense.
So, in addition to my little mighty staff of 3, I do have 2 legal advisors for EJ, and they are tracking everything. I mean, as soon as that letter of the 22 states kind of hit the airwaves, they were on it, looking to see, doing a deeper dive, seeing where things are, what states were signed on to that letter. So we're definitely looking at that. I say we, I use that loosely, but the lawyers that we have at DEP are definitely looking at it and looking to see how it's going to impact us and the work that we're trying to do as far as environmental justice in Title VI. So I can at least say we're looking at it to see how we can strategize.
One thing real quick. Yeah, I really appreciate you asking that question because I think it is really important. We are in this moment that feels a little bit like lightning in a bottle in terms of how much funding there is and how much attention there is to EJ. And the flip side of that is we're also in a moment where Title VI doesn't exist in Louisiana for the EPA and DOJ. And that could be the case for the rest of the country. And I think it is really important to sit with that. And so, yes, I am looking at what's happening elsewhere, and we're connected to folks who are part of a national network who are looking at things that are happening elsewhere. Because we can't. I think it's tempting to focus on the positives, but we can't look away. We have to, all of this is systemic, and a change in administration could undo a lot of the progress that has been made, and I think it is important to sit with that and as folks have said, to play defense.
Thank you. Just sort of highlighting accountability doesn't just mean for policies that are supposed to bring about positive change, but also thinking about accountability of laws and regulations that may make it more difficult to change. We'll, over here. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you everyone. My name is Noah Hirschhorn and I'm with Ramble Consulting, and I just had a general question for the entire panel. We've worked a lot with EJ screening tools and some of the cumulative impact assessment tools which were mentioned throughout many of the presentations, and these tools are a fantastic first step into understanding kind of broad level conditions in an area, but there are also many limitations and imperfections that exist with some of the maps, some of the tools. And I know that one way to kind of get a better picture is community engagement, because as mentioned, you're actually interacting with the community. My question is, what types of steps would you recommend in between that initial analysis and reaching out to community to help kind of solidify those results that you might be seeing from those initial tools? And what other data or advice would you have to help create the clearest picture possible when using those types of tools?
It's on, good. I'm happy to chime in. So with the tool that we have, I think some of the things that we're doing, it's fairly new, obviously. So one, watching census data as it's coming in and changing. Census tracks have, obviously, lines have been changed and things like that. And so that has been one of our challenges. I know with some of the imperfections is using older census data, and then some of the census data tracks having changed, and so it's not aligning. So utilizing like the technical assistance that we have internally, and then also doing some of our technical outreach and trainings that we have, just honestly having people come in and telling us about the problems that we're facing. We often do that, a lot of times people don't want to hear what you're doing wrong. I would say this is probably one of the times in administrations where we're kind of listening and hearing about the things that we're doing wrong and trying to make the necessary changes. So, we have a lot of technical assistance meetings or I guess I would say, open sessions where we do take kind of information from folks and are asking people to take a look at the tools and things like that to see where there are gaps. And people are working on it every single day, honestly, to try to fill the gaps and fix things. I mean, there are modifications that could be made every day. Nothing is kind of perfect at this point, at least for us.
Go ahead, yeah.
I'll just add, maybe it's adjacent to your question. The Science Advisory Board of the EPA has done a review of EJ Screen, and so you may want to look to their report, because I think they may touch on some of the same issues. And then the agency currently has a draft of what's called the EJ Technical Guidance, which is, it's not specific to a particular tool, but I think EJ Screen and screening methods, yeah, and I should say, screening methods are screening methods, and then there are also, various levels of complexity of other methodologies. But so that EJ Technical Guidance is currently undergoing review by the Science Advisory Board. So there's both a draft document, and then there's the SAB member comments, which may be interesting. And then Mechi and I are involved in supporting the SAB. They're doing a self-initiated study on EJ analysis, looking beyond the current technical guidance and sort of to the future refinements that may be possible. But something that we definitely hear quite a bit, and whether it's about EJ Screen or just about mapping tools in general, is that it's important to kind of validate those with the community, because while it's, I think it's a good faith effort to try to represent the situation in a community with available quantitative data, it doesn't really tell the story of that community. And it may not be at a sufficient level of spatial detail to catch things that are in the community. It just sort of averages them out, or you don't see them. And so, part of the research we're doing in ORD is looking at how can we incorporate hyperlocal data where such data exists, and that's another challenge, is that there's data gaps. So anyway, that probably doesn't answer your question, but just some other resources that you might look at.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one last question before we wrap up this evening.
Okay, this is a short one. I hope. I think this is a question for Secretary McBeth, but it might be for everybody. One of my concerns with EJ screening mapping tools and designations is that they leave as given segregation that has been built up over a century or more. Talk about redlining, but if you think about conflicts in the civil rights movement over who got to ride the bus where, we have all these instances of racial covenants in suburban mortgages that were financed by FHA. I guess one voice that I don't see here on this panel is HUD. They have tools, things like Section 8 vouchers, that allow people to relocate out of communities they don't want to live in. There was a fairly shocking poll that came out from residents of Detroit last year from Gallup that said that over half of Detroit residents would permanently leave the city if they could. So as far as respecting the voices of the communities, rather than just kind of leaving as fixed, these are communities that have these problems, and we need to just make their lives as least terrible as possible. Is there any conversation within the federal government talking about sort of breaking up this sort of long-term pattern of segregation that took place in a way that doesn't just sort of force people to stay where they are?
Did you want to take that question?
You're trying to get me fired.
Yeah.
I'm taking my government hat off. So I live in Baltimore, which is, I would say, one of the most well-known red line cities in the United States. If you're familiar with Baltimore, there's a book that that calls it the Black Butterfly, where the city has been systematically redlined. obviously, the Highway to Nowhere is one of the well-known highway projects that was built there. And so I think one of the challenges is, and me speaking as a resident in Baltimore, as somebody who works for the government, and a community association president, so I'm the whole gamut. So you're getting truth, you're getting government, you're getting everything. Don't tell my boss. But the honest part of it is I have watched a huge influx of people exit Baltimore with Section 8 vouchers to move to Baltimore County, where I used to live before I moved to the city. But in that aspect, I don't think anything is being fixed in that aspect. You're just systematically moving a problem because it's a holistic thing. I want to explain that part, right? Because Section 8 is still going to go with you. You know what I'm saying? It's not like you're not holistically fixing something, in my opinion. This is my opinion. But because, right, like they're still having a lack of access to transportation because now they're being moved to a suburban area with very limited transportation options. The bus, the subway comes infrequently. Baltimore, for example, only has a north-south subway system right now because we don't have east-west yet. So now they're limited. I'm giving you the best example I can give you, so you asked for it. So they have a north-south subway system. They have infrequent buses. There are food deserts to these folks because they don't have cars now. They can't get to a hospital as frequently as they could. They can't get their kids to school because they may not live in an area where their kids can be bused at the same time that they need to go to their shift working jobs. Should I keep going?
Can I?
But, I mean, I'm not trying to, I'm not railing on you, but I'm giving you the example of where it seems like it's a great option, but it can backfire, right? So what instead, in my opinion, could happen is systematically, what did I say before, is righting the wrongs of the past. So it isn't just simply fixing the transportation system, it's fixing the fact that they live in a food desert. It's making sure that the buses do run on time and every 20 minutes, and that the bus doesn't stop running at midnight because somebody works a 12 to 6 shift. You know what I'm saying? And then they can't get home from work. It's making sure that people have a safe bike lane because they then ride the bike to get to the bus stop that they need to. It's making sure that these people can go and, go play and do the things that they need to do. Like, all the people have all the access, and not just people being able to choose to ride a bus because they want to, or people taking a car because they can, or people having access to an Uber or a Lyft or anything like that. It's a holistic problem, or it's a holistic fix. It's not sending somebody somewhere else to have problems in a different place.
There's a couple ads, and thank you for taking that question. No, this is great. I'm so glad you were willing to take the question, and we'll go. We'll have 2 more comments and then wrap up.
Victoria, by the way. Not Veronica.
Yes. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So what you talked about is actually what we're hoping for. There's a lot of money that the administration has pumped into communities, and we're hoping that the recipients of these monies can draw from these different resource buckets to target those communities. Because what we're talking about, this holistic approach she mentioned, is it's an approach that's needed to tackle the multiple converging, adverse living conditions in these communities, whether it's transportation, housing quality, safety issues, environmental issues. So for example, at EPA, our office has the community change grants out there right now. And we're hoping that not only will our recipients take advantage of the EPA dollars, but that they can also access the other dollars that are out there. There's energy resources out there. I know that other federal agencies are putting out other resources. So the problem, if it is a problem, is I hope that communities know that these resources are available. We're doing our very best to talk to them. I would highly recommend the TICTACs, our EPA's Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, because one of the barriers is navigating government and even knowing that these resources exist. There's no digest. Well, the Federal Register is supposed to be the digest, but nobody reads the digest to know, your government is pumping money and it's time for you to use the money. So it's just, sharing information, communicating at forums like this, interacting with different community groups. But I would highly recommend the TICTACs because we're trying to set them up and we hope that they can help with that navigation. And just one last thing, usually when communities come to us, they may come in through the door because of an environmental issue, but they end up telling you about all the other things that are going on in the community. So that's why that's contact with the TICTACs is going to be very important.
I am going to have to cut this short because I just realized that we are several minutes over time, and just wanted to leave us with a couple of concluding takeaways. And actually, my very first statement was holistic approach as bullet number 1. So kind of thinking beyond just environmental exposures, but also looking at social and structural impacts that are making communities disproportionately burdened with health outcomes, and taking a holistic approach to addressing those. So thinking about research that looks across multiple lenses and not just one. The second takeaway that I had listed here is needing for studies to examine local to federal level policy actions to ensure that environmental racism is no longer entrenched, and kind of evaluating both the benefits of legal actions but also the consequences of legal actions that was brought up during our Q&A section. And the last one I wanted to leave on this one is about communication. So it's communication across disciplines, like with one another, but it's also really about communication with our communities. And so creating ways that the data that we collect as researchers or policy agencies is being translatable and usable by communities. So we can't have firewalls or make it difficult to assess our data. We should have it be available and usable by the communities that need it the most for actions, and then making sure that when we're talking that it's at a level that's understandable and interpretable, because we want to be sure that we are appropriately eliciting community perspectives and their context as experts. So I want to thank you all for staying extra. We had a lively discussion here with our panelists. So thank you so much for being willing to be here today and share your perspectives and experiences. And thank you to the audience for being here. There is nothing more after this event today. And so I guess we're closing out the HEI conference for today. And we welcome for a great day tomorrow that starts at 9 a.m. Yeah. Poster session.